So if I have to recommend one thing to anyone is just keep your camera on aperture priority and let the camera figure out everything. That's a great way to just start shooting. When I first started, I started shooting in program mode, the P mode, because it's just something I read somewhere. Then later realized if I shoot aperture priority, I can control the depth of field with the aperture and let the camera handle everything else. And later, as I started coming back home, looking at the photos, looking at what changes when I keep changing the aperture, the ISO changes, the shutter speed changes, that's when I started to understand how these parameters work together. They're basically just three parameters, right? There's aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Each thing controls two things, not one thing. If you talk about exposure, the only thing you need to remember when you talk about exposure is how bright is the image. That's all it means. It doesn't mean anything else. Sorry. Hello. One of the ways we control exposure or control brightness is to the aperture. So this is a lens. All aperture does is control the amount of light which hits the camera sensor. That's it. Now this is a camera sensor. ISO is basically changing the sensitivity of this sensor to make an image brighter or darker, changing the exposure. Last factor is the shutter. So this is a camera shutter that opens and closes. So that controls the amount of time light hits the sensor, again controls the exposure. This is a film camera, so this doesn't have a variable ISO. This is set for ISO 100 on this. So there's an ISO 100 roll of film inside this. So these are the three factors, 1, 2 and 3 here. Each aspect of these things, the aperture, shutter speed and ISO, control the exposure. So it is possible to have one change in such a way that makes the exposure brighter and have another factor change in such a way that makes the exposure darker. So it's possible to change these factors independently and still get the same exposure. You can change them in many combinations, still get the same exposure. That's called equivalent exposure. Aside from exposure, these factors change something else. So for example, the aperture controls depth of field in addition to the exposure. The shutter speed controls whether you want to make motion still or show the movement of something. The ISO doesn't really change much besides the exposure except the photo gets grainier. Each one of these things controls exposure and each one of these things has an impact aside from exposure. But it's completely possible to use three different combinations. So we are at 1.4 on this, at 1/4 of a second on this. So if I stop down on this and stop up on this and go from 1/4 of a second to half a second, now this is going to be a darker image. But if I go from 1.4 to 2, I've only changed each one of these by one notch or one stop. Now the exposures are the same as they were before. So if I do this and do this, that's the same as doing this and doing this. It's identical. So that's the idea of the equivalence there.